Do you think that's what we're missing nowadays? That we're missing like key biblical figures in the racial conversation? Because yeah, like you're saying, they came from religious, Christian, fundamental Christian beliefs. But is there any voice nowadays who's going from a fundamental Christian perspective?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, I don't know, were you asking me or just, or I guess I'll take a stab at it, because actually I'm going to tie it back to something that Tim Stratton said about the Black Lives Matter organization. To be honest with you, I abhor everything that they stand for in terms of the charter. You know what I'm saying? Now, I mean, well, other than the legitimate parts about Black Lives Mattering, but I mean, in terms of views on the family and things of that nature. I mean, and people who have looked at their website know what I mean. There are things that I abhor about it. At the same time, I almost, in some ways, lay their existence at the feet of the church. There's a guy that says, and I'm gonna mess his name up, and probably mess the quote up too. But he talks about how cults are the unpaid bills of the church. And I would say the same thing about Black Lives Matter. And the reason why I say that, and people can get mad if they want, it doesn't, whatever. But the bottom line is, the Bible says a lot about justice. It says a whole lot about what it means to live out the Imago Dei in the public square, in relationships, being even a citizen. The Bible has a whole lot to say about that. And, as people who are called to be Christ-like, called to be, the very essence of what an image bearer is, when the church abdicates its place in the public square of being that force for good and justice, when we take ourselves out of the mix, then we create a vacuum within which other groups can step in and then try to bring forth like a caricaturist version of whatever it is that the good really looks like. And then, analogously, now I recognize I'm using a war example. People may not be aware of it, but, in the Middle East right now, one of the reasons that ISIS was able to gain so much traction is because after the assassination of Saddam Hussein, it left a power vacuum to where they said, well, forget it. We're not going to be struggling over here trying to fight against, Assad. We're just going to go over here to Iraq where there's no power. There's this power gap. We're going to fill in over there and create our ISIS state. So this vacuum is created. And so what I'm saying is that when Christians don't do their due diligence to exemplify what it means to live out what Jesus refers to as the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. When we don't do that, then we create a situation where others are going to step in and botch the job. Like nobody should be louder for justice in society than the church. Nobody. So it shouldn't ever be the case that anybody should have to look to a Black Lives Matter to live out the biblical ethic of justice. Right. It should have some in-house civic organizations by which we can, be the arm of Christ in the world, exemplifying what his justice looks like, as the word says, to have our good works seen before men, that it honors our Father in heaven. That's what it really should look like. And so that's why when I get into conversations, like honestly, I don't even have conversations anymore about Black Lives Matter and whether it's right or wrong, unless we're going to talk about how we can not just oppose Black Lives Matter, but replace Black Lives Matter and say, well, okay, now we can agree, that we're not, that they stand for some terrible things, and I mean, we can go into that, but what are we going to do now? I'm saying, are we going to just leave it in May, or are we going to now say let's as Christians, as the church, take our rightful place and live out the biblical ethic of justice?
That's a super interesting point that you mentioned, Adam. The idea that as the church has kind of abdicated its place in the public square, the other entities have taken over. And I think that's what Dawkins and like Sam Harris and like Tom Holland are kind of getting at. They don't particularly like religion, but they recognize that when religion, in our specific case, the true religion, Christianity, takes a step back, it's not as though people just shut that part of their brain off. Like, I believe God created us. I believe the reason why religion pops up in so many different forms is because I believe God did create us with that type of religious type of mindset to be followers of, well, ultimately of Jesus. And so when people have rejected that, they're not going to just stop being religious. They're going to find some other entity to put their faith in. So, if Black Lives Matter is there, that becomes their means of, salvation, so to speak, because they can continually follow the, creed or the commandments that, I'm speaking sort of, analogously, but that Black Lives Matter puts forward as a way of attaining salvation. But the sad part is there isn't any salvation at the end. All you end up with is you're chasing something that can't exist, that we only get through Jesus. And that's the thing where I think the atheists miss is something is going to fill that religious void. We're all recognizing the problems in this world, and we're all searching for a solution to those problems. But without Jesus, there's nothing there to actually save us. It's just going to be an endless cycle of pursuing all of these different worldly solutions that don't ultimately end up working. And so it's just very, very sad to see that happen. And what Christians should be doing is, people have this mindset that they need to attain salvation. Like, that's perfect. We can just say, hey, it's Jesus. Like, Jesus is what you're searching for. And that's, I think that was a really interesting point, because I've been thinking about that the same way.
Yeah.
You know,
I like that.
You know, that's been a big complaint of mine for a long time, that all these other institutions exist because basically the church dropped the ball. Like, think about how many charities, how many organizations were started by the church. The church, Christian church, started universities. We started hospitals.
Yeah.
And then it's like, once they're set up, like nowadays, we're like, all right, that's that organization's job. But then don't get mad that those other organizations aren't doing things the way you want. Like, how many Christian, let's say, that lean Republican or conservative, they complained about things like welfare. They complained about things like bailouts and whatnot. And I'm looking at like, well, yeah, if you did your job, church, welfare wouldn't need to exist. Like, all these other institutions wouldn't need to exist. You know, like Christians complaining, why could any Christian ever vote Democrat? It's like, because you know what, the Democratic Party, at least, whether you believe that they're compassionate or not, at least they have compassion built into their platform, even if we think it's fake compassion, whatever people want to argue. But they do say that they care about the poor. They want to create programs. And it's just like, well, if the church were doing this, then these programs wouldn't need to exist. You know, if we were putting money in their offering plate to actually go to the poor and not to have, like, you know, nicer siding put on the church, or like, you know, comfier chairs, and actually took care of the poor, these institutions wouldn't, you know, need to exist. And hey, taxes will go down too. It's a win-win.
Or it may not be a matter of welfare. It may be, on a practical level, right? I mean, we could think about this concept of discipleship. Okay, you know, God has called us to be good stewards over the resources that we have, right? Now, if you have individuals who are in your church and not doing so well financially or whatever, it's certainly within the realm of discipleship to say, hey, we're going to offer some budgeting classes. We're going to teach you how to manage your resources, you know, so that you can be a better steward over what God has given you, right? And so now, you know, the church is not only just addressing the spiritual side, but stewardship is spiritual to some extent, right? And so those kind of things, I think, matter. And now you might have some benevolence as well, because people do fall into various situations. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So I think there's various rooms for benevolence. But really, just to answer your point, I do think that the church can be this dynamic force for good in the public square, and not doing good just for good's sake. I think that's where we get into the social gospel stuff, but really doing good for the gospel's sake. You know what I'm saying? Because it exemplifies the character of God. And ultimately, you know, we're pointing people to Christ. We should always be very explicit that that's what we're about, so they can't be confused that we're just doing good stuff. No, we're doing good stuff because we serve a good God and we want you to know him. That's really how it ought to be.
Right. I just want to make one more clarification, because Nuxa, I don't